So today I would like to present 3 practical Bible reading tips. Now, what I don't want to do in this video is I don't want to give you tips that are specific to me, that work for me and might not work for other people. I've tried to choose things that would be applicable to everybody, regardless of your situation, pretty much. So my goal today is to give you 3 practical Bible reading tips that have been helpful to me in the past, but that will also be helpful to you. So that brings me to my first major tip for reading the Bible, and that would be to read the Bible in context, or read verses in their proper context. This is something that, as I went through Bible college, I realized was very important. Now, to demonstrate why reading verses in their context is important, let me give you an example from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. This is a very famous verse, one that probably most people could quote to you regardless of their knowledge of the rest of the Bible. But the first part of Romans 8:28 says this, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good." Now, like I said, that's a very famous verse. Many people could probably quote that to you, but probably not many people could give you the context of that verse and quote to you actually the rest of that verse, verse 28, and then down into verses 29 and 30. If we take just the first part of verse 28, which says that God causes all things to work together for good, and we stop there and we ignore the rest of the context around the verse, we could come to some incorrect theological conclusions. For instance, one incorrect theological conclusion that we could come to just based on the first part of verse 28 is that God works for the good of everybody, both saved and unsaved. And I know people who would quote that verse and say that God works for the good of everybody. Now let me read for you Romans 8:26 through 30, which gives us a bigger context, and let us determine together who exactly we're talking about here. Are we talking about everyone? Are we talking about believers? Are we talking about unbelievers? Who are we talking about? So let me read that for you. "Now in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we should. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And these whom he predestined, he also called, and these whom he called, he also justified, and these whom he justified, he also glorified." So that's Romans 8:26 through 30. Now looking at that and having the broader context of the first part of Romans 8:28, we can see very clearly that the author is not talking about everyone in general. He is saying that God works for the good of those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. And then he goes on to list a string of more things that set these people apart from the unsaved. He says, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." Now, my goal here is certainly not to say that God doesn't care about the unsaved. That's not true. He absolutely does. But what I'm saying is that when we read verses in context, there are theologies that we can draw out of them, and then there are theologies that just cannot be drawn out of them. In this particular passage, he is saying that God will work all things together for the good of those who love him, for the good of his people, for the good of believers. So to include both unbelievers and believers into the promise of Romans 8:28, I think would be an incorrect theological conclusion to come to just based on the context of that particular scripture. Now that brings me to my second major tip for reading scripture. And the first and second tip here really lean on each other. They work well together. And so the second one will almost flow out of the first tip. My second tip for reading scripture is to read as large a chunk of scripture as you can manage in one sitting. Now, I think the first point and the second point work together well here for obvious reasons. I mean, the bigger chunk of continuous scripture that you read, the more context you will be getting to any particular verse in that section of scripture. Pay attention to context is my first tip, and my second tip is read bigger chunks of scripture when you read scripture. That way you will see arguments as they flow through the epistles, for instance, or you will see certain connections in narratives that you never saw before when you just read little tiny verses here and there. When you read big sections of scripture, you get more context, you get more understanding of what exactly is going on in that scripture. Now, when I say read as large a chunk as you can manage in one sitting, there are a couple constraining factors there, right? One big one would be time. You only have time to read a certain amount of scripture a day, probably. And so, obviously, if you're constrained to like 15 minutes, you're not going to be able to read like the whole book of Romans. But I think this tip still applies. No matter how much time you have, just try to read as big of a continuous chunk as you can, because I think you will get more out of Scripture that way. Another limiting factor would be attention. If you can't maintain attention on reading for a long period of time, then that's going to constrain how much you're going to be able to read. But again, I would just say read as big a continuous chunk as you can manage. And that brings me to my third major tip for reading Scripture, and that would be to read Scripture often. Now, I'll admit, this is something I've struggled with. I've always struggled maintaining a schedule of Scripture reading. There will be times where I'll read a lot of Scripture, and then there will be times where I don't read much at all. And that's not great. Generally, you want to have some consistency in your Scripture reading schedule, so to speak. I'm really bad at that, so that's an area where I definitely could use some improvement. But the reason that I say to read Scripture often is because we as people are really prone to forget about God. I mean, you see this theme all throughout Scripture, right? With the children of Israel, for instance, when Moses in Exodus 32 goes up to the top of Mount Sinai and is gone for an extended period of time, the Israelites get bored and they're like, well, forget Yahweh, forget God, let's build an idol, let's build a golden calf. And we sit here when we read these things and we're like, how could people so easily forget a God that they just watched descend upon a mountaintop in great power and glory? How could they forget about that God so quickly and move to worshiping a God of their own creation? We will see God show up, and then like a day later, we're into something else, and we've completely forgotten about this encounter we just had with God. When you read Scripture more often, you start to have a more continuous line of seeking after God, a more continuous heart toward God, as opposed to a very haphazard kind of lifestyle where you seek God and then you run away, and then you seek God and then you run away. A very good passage of Scripture for this idea of keeping God in your mind and keeping Him in the forefront of your life and keeping God in your remembrance is Deuteronomy 6. And that says, "Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your sons, and speak them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. You shall also tie them as a sign to your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall also write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." I love that passage of Scripture because it's a plea and even a command to God's people to say, remember your God, remember what God has brought you through, remember what He has done for you. And I just love that. So thanks for sticking around to the end of this video. If you enjoyed the video or if you found it helpful, I ask that you'd like the video and that you'd subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. I hope that this video was profitable to you in some way. So I'll see you next time.